The fluorescent lights of the Davidson County Courthouse buzzed with their characteristic drone, casting a sterile glow over the polished marble floors. Marcus Thompson stood in the hallway, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time that morning. His palms were sweaty, and he could feel his heart pounding against his ribs like a prisoner demanding release. At 28 years old, Marcus had worked harder than anyone he knew to get to this moment. 4 years of undergraduate studies at a state school while working 2 jobs. 3 grueling years at law school, where he'd graduated in the top 5% of his class. And now, 18 months into his career at a small civil rights law firm, he was about to argue his first major case in front of Judge Harold Whitmore. The case was straightforward, at least on paper. His client, Denise Washington, a 53-year-old schoolteacher, had been wrongfully terminated after reporting discriminatory practices at her school. The evidence was solid. The witnesses were credible. Marcus had prepared for weeks, memorizing every detail, anticipating every possible objection. But none of that preparation could quiet the voice in his head, the one that whispered all his deepest fears. "You ready for this?" The voice came from behind him, and Marcus turned to see his colleague and mentor, Patricia Chen, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. Patricia was in her early 50s, with silver streaks running through her black hair and the kind of calm confidence that only came from decades of courtroom experience. She'd taken Marcus under her wing when he first joined the firm, seeing something in him that others had overlooked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thanks for coming. You didn't have to." "Nonsense. First major case? I wouldn't miss it." She studied his face for a moment. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The one that says you're about to talk yourself out of believing you belong here." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That obvious, huh?" Patricia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, I've seen a lot of young lawyers come through. Most of them had every advantage, every connection, every opportunity handed to them on a silver platter. And you know what? Half of them couldn't argue their way out of a parking ticket. And the other half? They're the ones running the big firms now, making partner while the rest of us do the actual work." She smiled. "But that's not my point. My point is that you earned your place here. Not because of who your family is or what schools you attended or who you know, because of what's in here." She tapped his chest. "And here." She tapped his forehead. "Don't let anyone make you forget that." Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. "I won't." "Good. Now drink your coffee and get in there. You've got a client counting on you." The courtroom was smaller than Marcus had expected, with wooden benches worn smooth by generations of anxious family members and curious observers. The walls were lined with portraits of judges past, stern-faced men in black robes staring down at the proceedings below with what seemed like eternal disapproval. Marcus took his place at the plaintiff's table, arranging his files with meticulous care. Beside him, Denise Washington sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression a mixture of hope and quiet determination. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Washington?" Marcus asked softly. "Nervous," she admitted, "but grateful that someone believed me, that you believed me." "The evidence is on our side," Marcus assured her. "We just need to present it clearly and let the facts speak for themselves." "I know, She paused, her voice catching. 23 years I gave to that school, 23 years of showing up early, staying late, doing everything they asked and more. And when I finally spoke up about what was happening to the students, to my colleagues, they threw me away like I was nothing." Marcus felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that had drawn him to civil rights law in the first place. It was the same feeling he'd experienced countless times growing up, watching his own father navigate a world that seemed determined to undermine him at every turn. "That's why we're here," Marcus said firmly, to make sure they can't do that to anyone else. The side door opened, and opposing counsel entered. Richard Blackwell was everything Marcus wasn't. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of effortless charm that came from a lifetime of never being told no. He was a partner at one of the most prestigious firms in the state, and he'd made his reputation defending corporations against exactly the kind of case Marcus was bringing. Blackwell nodded at Marcus with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thompson, nice to see the little guy's still willing to take a swing." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. "Mr. Blackwell." Before either could say anything more, the bailiff's voice rang out through the courtroom. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Harold Whitmore presiding." Judge Whitmore entered through the door behind the bench, his black robe billowing slightly as he walked. He was in his late 60s, with a face that seemed to have been carved from granite and eyes that held the cold calculation of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Marcus had done his research on Whitmore. The judge had been on the bench for over 30 years, appointed during an era when the legal system was even less diverse than it was now. His rulings tended to favor defendants in civil cases, particularly when those defendants were corporations or institutions with deep pockets and influential connections. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. "Be seated," Judge Whitmore intoned, settling into his chair with the practiced ease of long habit. He shuffled through some papers on his desk before looking up at the courtroom. "Washington vs. Madison County School District. Are both parties ready to proceed?" "The plaintiff is ready, Your Honor," Marcus said, standing. "Defense is ready, Your Honor," Blackwell echoed. "Very well. Mr. Thompson, you may present your opening statement." Marcus rose, buttoning his jacket as he approached the podium. He'd rehearsed this speech dozens of times, but now, standing here in the actual courtroom, every word felt inadequate. He thought of Denise Washington, sitting behind him with her future hanging in the balance. He thought of all the people like her, people who had been silenced and dismissed and told that their experiences didn't matter. He thought of his father, who had spent his entire life fighting against the same forces that now arrayed themselves against Marcus's client. And then he began to speak. "Your Honor, this case is about a simple principle that lies at the heart of our legal system, the idea that no one should be punished for doing the right thing. Denise Washington dedicated 23 years of her life to the Madison County School District. She was an exemplary teacher, beloved by her students, respected by her colleagues. And when she witnessed discriminatory practices that were harming the very children she had sworn to protect, she did what any person of conscience would do. She spoke up." Marcus paused, letting the words settle. "For her courage, Mrs. Washington was rewarded with termination. Her career was destroyed. Her reputation was smeared. She was made an example of, a warning to anyone else who might think about challenging the status quo." He turned to look at Denise, then back at the judge. "Over the course of this trial, we will present evidence demonstrating that Mrs. Washington's termination was not based on performance or misconduct, but on retaliation for her protected activities. We will show that the school district engaged in a systematic pattern of discrimination that Mrs. Washington had every right, indeed, every obligation to report." He concluded with conviction, laying out the key points of their case before returning to his seat. Blackwell's opening statement was smooth and practiced, painting the school district as a victim of a disgruntled employee's unfounded accusations. He spoke of budget constraints and difficult decisions, of the need to maintain standards and the unfortunate necessity of letting go of underperforming staff. Marcus watched the judge's face throughout, trying to read his reactions. Whitmore remained impassive, his expression revealing nothing. The morning progressed with witness testimony. Marcus called Denise to the stand first, guiding her through her story with careful questions designed to highlight both the facts of the case and the emotional toll the situation had taken on her. Mrs. Washington, can you describe what you observed that led you to file your initial complaint? Denise's voice was steady, though Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly. I noticed that students from certain neighborhoods, predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhoods, were being disproportionately assigned to remedial classes regardless of their actual academic performance. When I reviewed the testing data, I found that many of these students had scores that qualified them for advanced placement, but they were never given the opportunity. And what happened when you brought this to the attention of the administration? At first, nothing. They thanked me for my concern and said they would look into it, but nothing changed. So I filed a formal complaint with the district office. And that's when things changed? Denise nodded, her jaw tightening. Within 2 weeks of filing that complaint, I received my first negative performance review in over 2 decades. Suddenly, everything I did was wrong. My lesson plans were inadequate. My classroom management was criticized. They started documenting every minor infraction, real or imagined. Objection, Blackwell interjected. Speculation. The witness is characterizing the district's legitimate performance concerns as retaliatory without any evidence of causation. Your Honor, Marcus responded, Mrs. Washington is simply describing her experience. We will present documented evidence of the timeline and nature of these performance reviews later in the trial. Judge Whitmore considered for a moment. Overruled. The witness may continue, but I'll expect that documentation, Mr. Thompson. Yes, Your Honor. The testimony continued, with Denise describing the escalating hostility she faced, the isolation from colleagues who were warned not to associate with her, and finally, the termination that came just weeks before she would have qualified for her full pension. When it came time for cross-examination, Blackwell approached the witness stand with the confident stride of a predator who had cornered his prey. Mrs. Washington, you mentioned that you received negative performance reviews following your complaint, but isn't it true that these reviews documented actual problems with your teaching? The reviews documented problems that had never been mentioned before in 23 years of service, Denise replied evenly. That's not what I asked. I asked whether the problems documented in those reviews were real. Some of them may have been real in the sense that they occurred, but they were taken out of context, exaggerated, or applied to me when other teachers who did the same things were never disciplined. So your position is that you were perfect, that you never made any mistakes? My position is that I was held to a different standard after I filed my complaint, a standard that was designed to fail. Blackwell smiled thinly. That's a convenient explanation, isn't it? Any criticism can be dismissed as retaliation. Objection, Marcus said, rising. Counsel is arguing with the witness. Sustained, Whitmore said, though he didn't look particularly bothered by Blackwell's tactics. Move on, Mr. Blackwell. The cross-examination continued for another hour, with Blackwell chipping away at Denise's credibility, while Marcus objected when he could, and made notes for redirect. By the time it was over, Denise looked exhausted, but unbowed. You did great, Marcus told her during the lunch recess. Exactly what we needed. It doesn't feel like enough, she said quietly. That man Blackwell, he's so smooth. He makes everything sound reasonable. That's his job, but the evidence is on our side. We just need to trust the process. It was something his father had always told him. Trust the process. Do the work. The truth will come out in the end. Marcus hoped it was still true. The afternoon session brought more witnesses, colleagues of Denise, who testified to her excellent reputation before the complaint, a statistician who analyzed the student placement data and confirmed the patterns Denise had identified, and a human resources expert who reviewed the documentation and found numerous procedural violations in the termination process. Each witness strengthened their case, but each also faced withering cross-examination from Blackwell. The man was good, Marcus had to admit. He had a way of making even the most solid testimony seem questionable, planting seeds of doubt without ever quite lying. By the time court adjourned for the day, Marcus was mentally and emotionally drained. He stayed behind as the courtroom emptied, organizing his files and reviewing his notes for the next day. Long day. Marcus looked up to find Judge Whitmore standing a few feet away, having descended from his bench. The judge's robe was unzipped, revealing a rumpled dress shirt beneath. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied carefully, unsure why the judge had approached him. Whitmore studied him with those cold, calculating eyes. "First major case, isn't it?" "It is." The judge glanced at the files on Marcus's table, then back at his face. "You're from around here, aren't you, Thompson? I feel like I know that name." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "I grew up in the area, yes." "Thought so. There was a Thompson who used to cause trouble around here back in the day. Community organizer type, always filing complaints, making noise. Any relation?" Marcus forced himself to remain calm. "My father was involved in community organizing, yes." Whitmore's expression shifted. Something like recognition mingled with contempt. "That's right, James Thompson. I remember now. He tried to file some kind of lawsuit against the county back in the 80s. Claimed they were discriminating in housing or some such nonsense. Case got thrown out, as I recall." "The case was dismissed on procedural grounds," Marcus said carefully, "not on the merits. Same difference in my experience. The point is, your father was always tilting at windmills, seeing conspiracies where there weren't any." Whitmore shook his head slowly. "I hope the apple fell far from the tree, Counselor. Because if you're bringing these kinds of cases just to make a political point, you're wasting everyone's time." Marcus felt the anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. "With respect, Your Honor, I'm bringing this case because my client was wronged. The evidence supports that." "Evidence can be interpreted many ways," Whitmore replied dismissively. "I've seen plenty of cases that looked good on paper but fell apart under scrutiny. Just make sure you're not letting your personal biases cloud your judgment." Before Marcus could respond, the judge turned and walked away, disappearing through the door behind the bench. Marcus stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. He thought about what Patricia had told him that morning, about believing he belonged here. He thought about his father, who had spent his entire life fighting for causes that people like Whitmore dismissed as nonsense. And he thought about Denise Washington, who had put her faith in him to make things right. He gathered his files and left the courtroom, more determined than ever. The second day of trial began much like the first, with Marcus presenting more evidence and Blackwell doing his best to undermine it. But there was a tension in the air now, a sense that the stakes had somehow risen overnight. Marcus called Dr. Eleanor Vance, an expert in employment discrimination, to the stand. Dr. Vance had reviewed the school district's records and found a clear pattern of retaliation against employees who raised concerns about discriminatory practices. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Vance testified, "Mrs. Washington's treatment fits the classic profile of retaliation. The timing of the negative reviews, the escalation of criticism, the isolation from colleagues, all of these are well-documented tactics used by organizations to punish whistleblowers." "And in your experience, how common is this type of retaliation?" Marcus asked. "Unfortunately, very common. Studies show that the majority of employees who report discrimination or other misconduct face some form of retaliation. Most of it goes unreported because victims fear that speaking up will only make things worse. Which is exactly what happened to Mrs. Washington." "Objection," Blackwell interjected. "Counsel is testifying." "Withdrawn," Marcus said smoothly. "Dr. Vance, based on your analysis, what conclusions have you reached about Mrs. Washington's termination?" My conclusion is that the termination was motivated primarily, if not entirely, by retaliation for her protected activities. The performance concerns cited by the district are pretextual and do not withstand scrutiny when examined in the context of her overall record. The cross-examination of Dr. Vance was extensive, with Blackwell challenging her methodology, her credentials, and her objectivity. But Dr. Vance was a seasoned expert witness, and she handled the attacks with calm professionalism. During a mid-morning recess, Marcus stepped out into the hallway to collect his thoughts. He found Patricia waiting for him with a fresh cup of coffee. "You're doing well," she said. "The expert testimony was solid. I think the judge is actually listening." "I'm not so sure about that," Marcus replied, accepting the coffee. He told her about his encounter with Whitmore the previous evening, about the judge's comments regarding his father. Patricia's expression darkened. "That's completely inappropriate. A judge shouldn't be making those kinds of comments to counsel." "I know, but what am I supposed to do? File a complaint? That would just give him another reason to rule against us." "You're probably right," Patricia sighed. "The system is broken, Marcus. You know that as well as anyone. All we can do is work within it and hope that eventually the truth wins out." "Trust the process," Marcus murmured. "What?" "Something my dad always used to say. Trust the process." Patricia smiled sadly. "Your father was a good man. I remember meeting him once, years ago, at a civil rights conference. He had this way of making everyone around him believe that change was possible, that we could actually make a difference." "He never stopped believing that," Marcus said. "Even after everything he went through, all the setbacks, all the disappointments, he never gave up." "That's rare," Patricia observed. "Most people get beaten down eventually. They learn to keep their heads low, to accept the way things are." "Not my dad. He always said that the only failure was giving up, that as long as you kept fighting, you were winning, even if the victories were small." "Sounds like you learned a lot from him." Marcus nodded slowly. "I did, more than I probably realized at the time." The recess ended, and they returned to the courtroom. Marcus called his final witness, a former administrator from the school district who had resigned in protest over the treatment of Denise Washington. Robert Hendricks was in his 60s, with the weary look of a man who had seen too many compromises and betrayals. He testified that he had witnessed the campaign against Denise firsthand and had tried to intervene, only to be warned that his own job would be at risk if he continued to advocate for her. "I knew what they were doing was wrong," Hendricks said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I had a family to support, a mortgage to pay. I told myself that I would fight from the inside, that I could do more good by staying than by leaving." "And what changed?" Marcus asked. "They fired her anyway, after everything, after all the warnings and the documentation and the charade of due process, they fired her. And I realized that there was no fighting from the inside. The system was designed to protect itself, not the people it was supposed to serve." "So you resigned?" "I resigned, and I've regretted my silence every day since." The cross-examination of Hendricks was brutal. Blackwell portrayed him as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind, someone who was exaggerating or misremembering events to serve his own interests. But Hendricks held firm, his testimony consistent and credible. As the second day drew to a close, Marcus felt cautiously optimistic. The evidence was strong. The witnesses had held up under pressure. All that remained was the closing arguments. But when court adjourned, Judge Whitmore called Marcus to the bench. "Mr. Thompson, I want to give you fair warning. Based on what I've seen so far, I'm not convinced that the plaintiff has met her burden of proof. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and I have serious concerns about the credibility of some of your witnesses." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Your Honor, with respect, the evidence clearly shows a pattern of retaliation. The timing, the documentation, the testimony, it all points to the same conclusion." Whitmore shook his head slowly. What I see is a pattern of interpretation. You've taken ordinary employment decisions and recast them as discrimination because that's the narrative you want to tell. But that's not how the law works, Counselor. You need more than circumstantial evidence and expert opinions. You need proof. We have proof, Marcus insisted. The statistical analysis alone shows clear discrimination in student placement. Mrs. Washington was fired for reporting that discrimination. The statistical analysis shows a correlation, Whitmore corrected. Correlation is not causation. Any first-year law student knows that. Marcus bit back his frustration. Your Honor, I intend to make our case in closing arguments. I would ask that you reserve judgment until then. Whitmore shrugged. Of course, that's your right. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing so far. I'd hate for you to be caught off guard by my ruling. It felt like a threat, or maybe a warning. Either way, Marcus left the courtroom that evening with a heavy heart. He called his father that night, needing to hear a familiar voice. James Thompson answered on the third ring. Marcus, how's the case going? Not great, Dad. Marcus told him about the evidence, the witnesses, and most importantly, about Judge Whitmore's warnings. He practically told me he's going to rule against us, and I think it's personal. He remembered you, Dad. He remembered the housing case you filed back in the 80s. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Harold Whitmore, James said finally. I remember him. He was a young prosecutor back then. Ambitious. Always had his eye on the judiciary. He made it clear that he thinks I'm wasting everyone's time, just like he thought you were. Well, he was wrong about me, and he's wrong about you. But what if he rules against us? What if all this work, all this evidence, it doesn't matter because one biased judge has already made up his mind? Then you appeal, James said simply. You keep fighting. You don't let one loss define you. It's not about me, Dad. It's about Denise. She's counting on me, and I'm going to let her down. Listen to me, son. James's voice was firm but gentle. I spent my whole life fighting battles that other people said I couldn't win. And you know what? A lot of them said they were right. I lost more cases than I won. But every time I stepped into that courtroom, every time I raised my voice for someone who couldn't raise their own, I was making a statement. I was saying that their lives mattered, that their experiences were real, that they deserved justice. And if we don't get justice this time, then we try again and again and again, until they can't ignore us anymore. That's how change happens, Marcus. Not all at once, but inch by inch, case by case, generation by generation. You're part of that legacy now. Win or lose, you're continuing the work. Marcus felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. I wish you were here, Dad. I'm always with you, son. Now get some sleep. You've got a big day tomorrow. The final day of trial arrived under grey skies, the kind that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Marcus arrived at the courthouse early, his closing argument memorized and ready. But as he walked through the doors, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A crowd had gathered in the lobby. Dozens of people, maybe more, many of them wearing shirts that read, "Justice for Denise," or carrying signs with similar messages. Some of them were former students, now grown, who had reached out to the firm after hearing about the case. Others were teachers from across the county who had faced similar retaliation and wanted to show their support. At the center of the crowd stood Patricia, who caught Marcus's eye and smiled. "What is this?" Marcus asked, approaching her. "This is what happens when you fight for something that matters," Patricia replied. "People notice, people care. Even if the judge doesn't want to see it, the community does." Marcus looked at the faces around him, young and old, black and white, all united in their support for Denise Washington and the principle she represented. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. "Neither did I," Patricia said, "but I think it's exactly what we needed." The courtroom was packed when proceedings began. Judge Whitmore surveyed the crowd with barely concealed displeasure, but he said nothing as he took his seat. "Closing arguments," he announced. "Mr. Thompson, you may proceed." Marcus rose, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon him. He walked to the podium, placed his notes before him, and then pushed them aside. "Your Honor," he began, "I had a speech prepared for today, a carefully crafted argument that walked through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every legal precedent that supports our case. But I've decided to set that aside, because I think this case is about something more than evidence and precedents. It's about the fundamental question of what kind of society we want to live in." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Denise Washington is a teacher. For 23 years, she dedicated her life to educating children, to helping them realize their potential, to preparing them for the challenges they would face in the world. And when she saw that some of those children were being denied opportunities because of where they came from or what they looked like, she did what any good teacher would do. She spoke up. Marcus turned to look at Denise, who sat at the plaintiff's table with tears streaming down her face. For her courage, Mrs. Washington was punished. Her career was destroyed. Her reputation was smeared. She was made an example of, a warning to anyone else who might think about challenging the status quo. He turned back to the judge. "The defense has argued that Mrs. Washington's termination was a legitimate employment decision based on documented performance concerns, but the evidence tells a different story. The evidence shows that those performance concerns only appeared after Mrs. Washington filed her complaint. The evidence shows that Mrs. Washington was treated differently than other employees who had similar or worse performance issues. The evidence shows that the school district engaged in a systematic campaign to discredit and ultimately terminate a woman whose only crime was telling the truth." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "This case is about more than one teacher and one school district. It's about whether we live in a society where people can speak up about wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. It's about whether the powerful can silence the powerless simply because they have more resources, more connections, more ability to manipulate the system." He glanced at the crowd filling the courtroom. "Look around this room, Your Honor. These are people who came here today because they believe in justice. They believe that what happened to Denise Washington was wrong, and they want to see it made right. They're not here because I asked them to be. They're here because they understand what's at stake." Marcus took a deep breath, preparing for his conclusion. "My father spent his whole life fighting for people who had been told their voices didn't matter. He filed lawsuits and organized protests and testified before committees, not because he thought he would always win, but because he believed that the fight itself had value, that standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you, is what separates a just society from an unjust one." He looked directly at Judge Whitmore. "I'm asking you to rule in favor of Denise Washington, not because of the evidence, although the evidence clearly supports her, not because of the law, although the law is on her side. I'm asking you to rule in her favor because it's the right thing to do, because sending a message that retaliation will not be tolerated is more important than any precedent or procedure. Because the people in this courtroom and the thousands more who are watching and waiting deserve to know that their legal system still stands for something." Marcus returned to his seat, his heart pounding. He had said everything he wanted to say. Now all he could do was wait. Blackwell's closing argument was polished and professional, hitting all the expected notes about burden of proof and circumstantial evidence and the dangers of letting emotion override reason. But even as he spoke, Marcus noticed something. The energy in the room had shifted. The crowd was restless, unconvinced. Even Judge Whitmore seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally drifting to the faces filling the gallery. When both sides had finished, Judge Whitmore announced that he would issue his ruling after a brief recess. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people stretched their legs and whispered to each other. Marcus found Denise in the hallway, surrounded by supporters. "Whatever happens," she told him, "I want you to know that I'm grateful. Grateful that you took my case, that you believed me, that you fought for me. Even if we lose, I'll never forget what you did." "We haven't lost yet," Marcus said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I know, but I also know how these things usually go. People like us, we don't always get the endings we deserve." Before Marcus could respond, the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. Judge Whitmore had returned. The room fell silent as the judge took his seat. He shuffled some papers, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "This has been a challenging case. Both sides have presented compelling arguments, and I've had to weigh evidence that points in different directions. But ultimately, my job is not to decide what I wish were true, but what the law requires." Marcus felt his heart sink. This was the preamble to a loss. He could feel it coming. "However," Whitmore continued, and something in his tone shifted, "I've also had to consider the broader context of this case, the community's interest in the outcome, the message that my ruling will send about the consequences of retaliation." He paused, looking out at the packed courtroom. "I have to confess that when this case first came before me, I had certain preconceptions about the plaintiff, about her counsel, about the nature of the claims being made. I allowed those preconceptions to color my judgment in ways that were inappropriate." Marcus exchanged a glance with Patricia, who looked as surprised as he felt. "But sitting here today, listening to the closing arguments, seeing the faces of the people who came to bear witness, I've been reminded of something I had forgotten. The law is not just about rules and procedures. It's about justice. And justice requires that I set aside my personal biases and focus on what the evidence actually shows." Whitmore took a deep breath. "The evidence shows that Denise Washington was an exemplary employee for over 2 decades. The evidence shows that her performance issues only arose after she filed a complaint about discriminatory practices. The evidence shows that she was treated differently than other employees in similar situations. And the evidence shows that the school district failed to follow its own procedures in terminating her employment." Marcus felt hope rising in his chest. "Based on the preponderance of evidence presented, I find in favor of the plaintiff. Mrs. Washington is entitled to reinstatement, back pay, and damages for the emotional distress caused by her wrongful termination. The amount of those damages will be determined in a subsequent hearing." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Denise collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobbing with relief. Patricia pumped her fist in the air. Even some of the journalists who had come to cover the trial were grinning. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel, trying to restore order. "Quiet down, all of you. This is still a court of law." But even he seemed unable to suppress a small smile. After the crowd had dispersed and the paperwork had been signed, Marcus found himself alone in the courtroom. He was gathering his files when he heard footsteps behind him. "Mr. Thompson." He turned to find Judge Whitmore approaching. "Your Honor?" Whitmore stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "I owe you an apology for what I said the other day, about your father." Marcus waited, unsure how to respond. "I knew your father," Whitmore continued. "Not well, but we crossed paths a few times over the years. I always thought he was a troublemaker, someone who saw discrimination everywhere he looked, because that's what he wanted to see." "And now?" Whitmore sighed heavily. "Now I wonder if maybe he was just seeing things more clearly than the rest of us. It's easy to dismiss claims of injustice when you've never experienced it yourself. It's easy to assume that the system is fair when the system has always worked in your favor." Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked. Because I think you deserve to know that my ruling today wasn't just about the evidence. It was about me realizing that I've spent too long on this bench without questioning my own assumptions. Your father tried to tell me something 40 years ago, and I didn't listen. Maybe it's not too late to start. Marcus considered this for a moment. My father always said that it's never too late to do the right thing. As long as you're breathing, you can change. Whitmore nodded slowly. He sounds like a wise man. He is. The judge extended his hand. Tell him I said hello, and that I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. Marcus shook the offered hand. I will, Your Honor. Whitmore turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He looked around the empty courtroom, at the portraits of judges past, staring down from the walls, at the worn wooden benches and the faded carpet, and all the other markers of a system that was older and more complicated than any single person could fully comprehend. And he thought about his father, who had spent his whole life fighting for a better world, one case at a time. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed. Dad, we won. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of activity. News of the verdict spread quickly, covered not just by local media, but by national outlets hungry for stories about ordinary people taking on powerful institutions and winning. Denise Washington became something of a celebrity, appearing on talk shows and at conferences to discuss her experience. She used her newfound platform to advocate for stronger whistleblower protections and to encourage others who had faced retaliation to come forward. Marcus found himself fielding calls from potential clients across the country, people who had heard about the case and wanted someone who would fight for them with the same passion and dedication. Patricia joked that they might need to hire more staff just to handle the intake. But amidst all the excitement, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The victory was real, but it was just one case. There were thousands of others out there, people who had been wronged and had no one to speak for them. The system that had allowed Denise's termination was still in place, still grinding away, still finding new victims. It was his father who helped him put things in perspective. You can't save everyone, James told him during one of their regular phone calls. That's not how change works. You save one person, and that gives hope to the next person, who gives hope to the person after them. It's a chain reaction. Your job isn't to fix everything. Your job is to keep the chain going. Is that enough? Marcus asked. Just keeping the chain going? It has to be, because the alternative is giving up. And giving up means the other side wins. The people who want to keep things the way they are, who benefit from injustice, who profit from silence, they win every time someone decides that fighting isn't worth it. I don't want to give up, Marcus said. I never have. I know. That's why I'm proud of you, son. Not because you won this case, although that was nice, but because you showed up, you did the work, you made the argument. Even when the judge seemed determined to rule against you, you didn't back down. I almost did, Marcus admitted. There were moments when I thought it was hopeless, when I thought Whitmore had already made up his mind and nothing I said would change it. But you kept going anyway. That's the definition of courage, Marcus. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Marcus thought about that a lot in the following days. He thought about all the people who had come before him, the ones who had fought and lost, who had been beaten down and silenced and forgotten. He thought about the ones who had kept going anyway, who had refused to surrender even when every indication suggested they should. He thought about his father, who had dedicated his entire life to a cause that most people considered unwinnable, who had faced criticism and mockery and failure, and who had never once considered giving up. And he realized that the legacy wasn't about any single case or any single victory. It was about the commitment to keep fighting, no matter what. To keep showing up, Keep making the argument. Keep pushing against the weight of an unjust system until, eventually, inevitably, something gave way. 3 months after the trial, Marcus received a letter that would change everything. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and junk mail, but there was nothing ordinary about the envelope. It was cream-colored, heavy, with an embossed return address that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. Supreme Court of the United States. He stared at the envelope for a long moment, trying to imagine what it could possibly contain. Was it related to one of his cases? Had some obscure filing crossed the desk of a justice who wanted more information? With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was brief but formal, written in the precise legal language that characterized all Supreme Court communications. It began with the usual salutations and then got straight to the point. The court was announcing a new initiative focused on access to justice for underrepresented communities. As part of this initiative, they were inviting a select group of attorneys to participate in a symposium at the Supreme Court building, where they would discuss strategies for expanding legal services and reducing barriers to the legal system. Marcus's name was on the list of invited attorneys. But that wasn't what made him drop into his chair, his mind reeling. It was the signature at the bottom of the letter, the name of the justice who was leading the initiative and had personally selected the participants. Justice James R. Thompson. His father. Marcus read the letter 3 more times, certain he must be misunderstanding something. His father had never mentioned anything about this. In all their conversations, all their discussions about the case and the verdict and what came next, James had never once hinted that he was involved in any Supreme Court initiative. He grabbed his phone and called, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his phone rang. "I see you got the letter," James said. "Dad, what is this? What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When James spoke again, his voice was heavy with emotion. "I've been keeping something from you, Marcus. Something I probably should have told you a long time ago." "Keeping what? Dad, you're scaring me." "When I was a young lawyer, not much older than you are now, I argued a case before the Supreme Court. It was a housing discrimination case, similar to the one that got dismissed back in the 80s, but with stronger evidence. The court ruled in my favor, unanimously. It was one of the landmark decisions of the decade." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. "I never knew that." "I know. I never talked about it. After the ruling, I was approached by several prominent politicians who wanted me to run for office. They said I could do more good from a position of power, but I turned them down. I thought I could do more good in the trenches, fighting individual cases, helping individual people. But a few years later, one of those politicians became president, and he remembered me. He offered me a federal judgeship. I turned that down too. And then, about 15 years ago, he offered me something else, a seat on the Supreme Court." Marcus couldn't breathe. "You're a Supreme Court justice this whole time?" "Not this whole time. I was confirmed about 12 years ago. But I asked that my appointment be kept private. I didn't want the attention. I didn't want people treating me differently, and I especially didn't want my decisions on the bench to be influenced by anyone's expectations of who I was supposed to be." "But how is that even possible? Supreme Court justices are public figures. Their names are everywhere." James laughed softly. "You'd be surprised how little attention most people pay to the court. We don't have press conferences or campaign rallies. We issue opinions and attend ceremonies and mostly stay out of the spotlight. It's not that hard to maintain a low profile if you're determined to do it." "But why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me struggle through law school, through my career, never knowing that my father was one of the most powerful judges in the country? Because I wanted you to earn your success on your own terms. I didn't want you to be Justice Thompson's son. I wanted you to be Marcus Thompson, attorney at law, a man who built his reputation through his own hard work and talent. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. All those times I asked for advice, all those times I told you about my cases, you could have just made a phone call. You could have made things so much easier. That wouldn't have been right, Marcus. You needed to find your own path. You needed to face the same obstacles that everyone else faces, to understand what the system is really like for people who don't have connections or advantages. That's what makes you a good lawyer. That's what made you fight so hard for Denise Washington. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come to the symposium. I've watched your career from a distance for so long. I'd like the chance to introduce you to my colleagues, to show them the man my son has become. Marcus wiped his eyes. Of course I'll come, but Dad, this changes everything. How am I supposed to go back to my regular life, knowing that my father is on the Supreme Court? The same way I've gone to work every day knowing that my son is making a difference in people's lives. One step at a time, one case at a time, one day at a time. Marcus laughed, a release of tension that had been building since he opened the envelope. You're impossible, you know that. So I've been told. Now get back to work, Counselor. Justice waits for no one. The symposium was scheduled for the following month, giving Marcus time to process the revelation and prepare for what lay ahead. He told Patricia, who reacted with characteristic pragmatism. I always knew there was something unusual about your family, she said. Your father's legal knowledge was too deep, too specific for someone who supposedly just did community organizing. You suspected? Let's say I had questions, but it wasn't my place to pry. Fair enough. The days leading up to the symposium were a blur of activity. Marcus wrapped up his current cases, delegating some to junior attorneys and putting others on hold. He bought a new suit, had his shoes shined, and practiced his talking points in front of the mirror until Patricia told him to stop before he drove himself crazy. And then finally the day arrived. The Supreme Court building was even more imposing in person than Marcus had imagined. The massive columns, the wide marble steps, the inscription above the entrance, equal justice under law. It was a monument to the ideals that had inspired generations of lawyers, a physical manifestation of the belief that the law could be a force for good in the world. Marcus climbed the steps slowly, taking it all in. He thought about all the cases that had been decided here, all the arguments made and opinions written, all the lives changed by the words that emerged from this building. And he thought about his father, who had been part of this institution for over a decade, without Marcus ever knowing. Inside, he was greeted by a young clerk who led him through a series of hallways to a conference room where the other symposium participants had gathered. There were about 20 of them, attorneys from across the country who had been selected for their work on access to justice issues. Marcus recognized a few names from his research, prominent figures in the legal aid community. He took a seat near the back, trying to blend in with the crowd. But before long, the door at the front of the room opened, and 3 Supreme Court justices entered. 2 of them Marcus recognized from television and news coverage. The third was his father. James Thompson looked different in his judicial robes, more formal, more authoritative, but his eyes were the same, warm and wise and filled with the same determination that had driven him for as long as Marcus could remember. Good morning, everyone, James began. Thank you for joining us. This symposium represents something I've been working toward for years. A serious, sustained effort to make our legal system more accessible to those who need it most. He went on to outline the goals of the initiative, the areas of focus, the resources that would be made available to participants. It was a comprehensive and ambitious plan, the kind of thing that could only come from someone who had spent a lifetime thinking about these issues. As he spoke, James's eyes occasionally found Marcus in the crowd, and each time a small smile played at the corners of his lips. When the formal presentations were over, there was a reception in an adjacent room. Marcus found himself surrounded by colleagues eager to discuss the initiative and share their own experiences. But he kept glancing toward his father, who was engaged in conversation with the other justices. Finally, James extricated himself and made his way over. "You made it," he said quietly. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away." James smiled. "Come, there's someone I want you to meet." He led Marcus through the crowd to a small alcove where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair. She was frail but alert, her eyes bright with intelligence. "Marcus, this is Justice Eleanor Mitchell. She was my mentor when I first joined the court. Eleanor, this is my son, Marcus." Justice Mitchell extended a trembling hand. "I've heard so much about you, young man. Your father never stops talking about your cases." Marcus felt his face flush. "I hope they're good things." "The best. He told me about the Washington case, said it was one of the finest pieces of advocacy he's seen in years." "I don't know about that." "I do," James interjected. "I've been on the bench for over a decade, Marcus. I've seen thousands of cases, thousands of arguments. What you did in that courtroom was special. The way you connected with the community, the way you refused to back down even when the judge seemed determined to rule against you, that takes something that can't be taught." Marcus didn't know what to say. All his life he had looked up to his father, had tried to live up to the example James had set. And now here was his father, telling him that he had exceeded expectations. "I learned from the best," Marcus finally managed. James shook his head. "No, you found your own way. That's what I always wanted for you. Not to follow in my footsteps, but to make your own path. And you have." The reception continued for another hour, filled with conversations and connections that would shape Marcus's career for years to come. But through it all, he kept returning to that moment with his father, the acknowledgement that he had become his own man, with his own achievements and his own legacy. As the symposium drew to a close, Marcus found himself standing at a window overlooking the National Mall. The monuments stretched before him, testaments to the ideals that had founded a nation and the struggles that had shaped its history. "Penny for your thoughts," James said, coming to stand beside him. "Just thinking about the future, about what comes next." "And what does come next?" Marcus turned to face his father. "I want to do more. The Washington case was important, but it was just one case. There are so many others out there, so many people who need help. I want to find a way to reach them." James nodded slowly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking this initiative needs. We're building a network, Marcus, a community of attorneys committed to expanding access to justice. I'd like you to be part of it." "In what capacity?" "Whatever capacity you want. You could stay at your current firm and take on more pro bono cases. You could join one of the legal aid organizations we're partnering with. You could even start your own practice focused exclusively on civil rights. Or," James smiled, "or you could come work here, as a clerk, learning the ins and outs of the Supreme Court from the inside. It would be a different kind of education than what you've had so far, but I think you'd find it valuable." Marcus considered the offer. Working at the Supreme Court, learning from his father and the other justices, gaining insights into the highest levels of the legal system. It was an opportunity that very few attorneys ever received. But it also meant stepping away from the front lines, leaving behind the cases and clients that had defined his career so far. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's a lot to think about." "Take your time, there's no rush. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." "Thanks, Dad." They stood together in silence for a long moment, father and son, two generations of fighters united by their commitment to justice. I'm proud of you, Marcus, James said finally. Not because of what you've accomplished, although that's impressive, but because of who you've become, a man of integrity, a man who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's the legacy that matters, not titles or positions or accolades, character. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. Character. It was what his father had been teaching him all along, not through lectures or lessons, but through example, through showing up every day, doing the work, fighting the good fight. I'll try to live up to it, Marcus said. You already have. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the lobby of the Davidson County Courthouse, the same place where his journey had begun. But everything was different now. He was there to announce the opening of the Thompson Justice Center, a new legal aid organization funded by a grant from the Supreme Court's Access to Justice initiative. The center would provide free legal services to low-income residents facing discrimination, retaliation, and other civil rights violations. The lobby was packed with supporters, journalists, and community members. Denise Washington was there, now working as the center's outreach coordinator. Patricia Chen was there, having agreed to serve on the board of directors. And in the front row, wearing a simple suit instead of his judicial robes, was James Thompson. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his notes clutched in his hands. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had come to witness this moment, and felt a surge of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. Thank you all for being here today, he began. This center represents the culmination of a dream that I've carried with me since I first decided to become a lawyer. A dream of a world where everyone has access to justice, regardless of their income or background or connections. He paused, looking at his father. I didn't get here alone. I had mentors and colleagues and clients who pushed me to be better than I thought I could be. And I had a father who taught me, through his words and his actions, that the fight for justice is never over, that every case matters, that every person deserves someone who will stand up for them. Marcus turned back to the crowd. The Thompson Justice Center is named in honor of that lesson. Not in honor of any single person, but in honor of the idea that we all have a responsibility to use our skills and our knowledge for the benefit of others. That the law, at its best, is a tool for leveling the playing field, for giving voice to the voiceless, for holding the powerful accountable. He took a deep breath. I don't know what the future holds. There will be cases we win and cases we lose. There will be moments of triumph and moments of despair. But whatever happens, we will keep fighting. We will keep showing up. We will keep making the argument that justice matters, that people matter, that the promise of equal treatment under the law is worth the effort required to achieve it. The crowd burst into applause. Marcus stepped away from the microphone, accepting handshakes and hugs from the people around him. But through the chaos, his eyes found his father's. James nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and approval, and in that simple nod, Marcus saw everything: the years of struggle and sacrifice, the quiet lessons and the hard-won victories, the legacy that had been passed from one generation to the next. He was ready to carry it forward. The months that followed the center's opening were a whirlwind of activity. Cases poured in, more than Marcus had anticipated. Discrimination claims, wrongful terminations, housing disputes, all the myriad ways that the powerful could exploit the powerless. Marcus threw himself into the work with a passion that surprised even himself. He arrived early and stayed late, reviewing files, preparing arguments, meeting with clients who often arrived at the center's doors with nothing but hope and the clothes on their backs. Denise proved invaluable in her new role, connecting with community members who had been conditioned to distrust the legal system. She spoke at churches and community centers, sharing her story and encouraging others to come forward with their own. People need to know that someone is listening, she told Marcus one evening as they were reviewing the day's intake. For so long, they've been told that there's no point in fighting back, that the system is rigged against them. We're showing them that's not always true. Sometimes it is, though, Marcus admitted. We've lost cases, we'll lose more. I know, but we've won some too, and every win gives someone hope that their story matters, that their voice can be heard. It was the same lesson his father had been teaching him all along, the lesson that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his career. Keep fighting, keep showing up, keep believing that change is possible, even when all the evidence suggests otherwise. One afternoon, about 8 months after the center opened, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. He was in his office, reviewing documents for an upcoming trial, when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." Marcus frowned. "Who is it?" "Judge Harold Whitmore." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen or spoken to Whitmore since the Washington trial. The judge's surprising ruling, his apology afterward, all of it had faded into memory as Marcus focused on building the center and taking on new cases. "Send him in." Whitmore entered slowly, looking older than Marcus remembered. His face was more lined, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes were still sharp, still filled with that calculating intelligence that had made him such a formidable presence on the bench. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for seeing me." "Judge Whitmore, this is unexpected." "I imagine it is." Whitmore glanced around the office, taking in the stacks of files, the motivational posters on the walls, the photographs of clients and community events. "You've built something impressive here." "We're trying." "You're succeeding." The judge lowered himself into a chair across from Marcus's desk. "I've been following your work, the cases you've taken, the outcomes you've achieved. It's remarkable." "Thank you." "I've also been doing some thinking about my own career, about the decisions I've made over the years, about the harm I may have caused." Marcus waited, unsure where this was heading. "When your father and I crossed paths back in the 80s, I was convinced that he was the problem, that people like him, who saw discrimination everywhere, who filed lawsuits and organized protests, were tearing the community apart. I thought I was on the side of stability, of order, of the way things were supposed to be." Whitmore shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. It took me decades to realize it, but I was wrong. The stability I was protecting was built on injustice. The order I was defending kept people locked out of opportunities they deserved. I told myself I was being fair, being impartial, but I was really just reinforcing a system that benefited people like me at the expense of people like your clients." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to help." Whitmore leaned forward. "I've spent 40 years on the bench. I have knowledge and connections that could be valuable to your work, and I have a lot of wrongs to make up for." Marcus studied the man before him, the judge who had once dismissed his father's life work as tilting at windmills, the man who had tried to intimidate Marcus during the Washington trial, now sitting here, humble and contrite, asking for a chance to contribute. "What did you have in mind?" "Whatever you need. I could consult on cases, help with strategy, testify as an expert witness on judicial procedures. I could reach out to colleagues who might be sympathetic to your cause. I could use whatever influence I have left to advocate for the changes you're trying to make." "Why now? Why the sudden change of heart?" Whitmore smiled sadly. "Because I'm old, Mr. Thompson, and I've started thinking about how I'll be remembered, what my legacy will be. For too long I've been comfortable. I've told myself that as long as I followed the rules, as long as I applied the law as written, I was doing my job. But the law isn't neutral. The way it's written, the way it's enforced, the way it's interpreted, all of it reflects choices, and those choices have consequences." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Your father understood that. He saw that the system wasn't working for everyone, and he dedicated his life to changing it. I dismissed him as a troublemaker, but he was right and I was wrong. I can't undo the past, but I can try to do better with whatever time I have left." Marcus considered the offer. Part of him wanted to reject it outright, to tell Whitmore that his help wasn't wanted or needed. But another part, the part that his father had nurtured, reminded him that change required allies, that winning over former opponents was as important as mobilizing supporters. "All right," Marcus said finally, "let's talk about how you can help." The partnership with Judge Whitmore proved more valuable than Marcus had expected. The judge's insights into the workings of the judiciary, his connections with other judges and lawyers, his understanding of the subtle ways that bias could creep into legal proceedings, all of it enhanced the center's effectiveness. But more importantly, Whitmore's involvement sent a message. If even someone who had spent decades upholding the status quo could recognize the need for change, then maybe change was possible. Maybe the walls that had seemed so immovable were beginning to crack. A year after the center opened, Marcus was invited to speak at the National Bar Association's annual conference. It was a prestigious honor, a recognition of the work he and his team had accomplished. He stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of thousands, lawyers from across the country who had come to learn and network and advance their careers. "When I started this journey," Marcus began, "I was told repeatedly that I didn't belong, that people like me, from backgrounds like mine, couldn't succeed in the legal profession. I was told that the system was designed for others, that my best hope was to keep my head down and accept whatever crumbs fell from the table." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I refused to accept that, not because I was confident or brave, but because I had no other choice. Fighting back was the only way I knew to survive, to maintain my dignity, to honor the sacrifices of those who came before me." Marcus thought of his father watching from the front row, of Denise Washington, who had flown in from Davidson County to be here, of Patricia Chen, who had mentored him through his early years, of all the clients he had represented, all the stories he had heard, all the injustices he had witnessed. The legal profession has a choice to make. We can continue to be guardians of the status quo, protecting the interests of the powerful against the claims of the powerless. Or we can become agents of change, using our skills and our knowledge to build a more just society. He leaned forward, his voice rising with conviction. "I know which choice I've made, and I hope standing here today that you'll make the same one, not because it's easy, because it isn't, not because it's popular, because often it isn't that either, but because it's right, because the promise of equal justice under law demands nothing less." The applause that followed was thunderous, wave after wave of sound washing over Marcus as he stepped back from the podium. He had said what he came to say. Now the work continued. Afterward, at the reception, Marcus was approached by a young woman in her early 20s. She was nervous, clutching a law school acceptance letter in her trembling hands. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to say that your speech inspired me. I've been told my whole life that I can't be a lawyer, that people from my neighborhood don't make it in this profession. But listening to you, I realize that's just another obstacle to overcome, another wall to break through." Marcus smiled, remembering all the times he had felt the same way. "What's your name?" Maria Gonzalez." "Well, Maria, let me tell you something. The people who tell you that you can't succeed, they're not trying to help you. They're trying to protect themselves. They're afraid of what happens when people like us start claiming our place at the table." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "So prove them wrong. Work hard, study harder, find mentors who believe in you and learn everything they can teach you. And when you pass the bar and start practicing, remember where you came from. Use your success to lift others up, just like others lifted you." Maria's eyes were shining. "I will, Mr. Thompson, I promise." "Good. Now go enjoy the reception. And if you ever need advice or support, look me up. The Thompson Justice Center is always looking for talented attorneys. As Maria walked away, Marcus felt his father's hand on his shoulder. "That was well done," James said quietly. "I learned from the best." They stood together for a moment, watching the crowd of lawyers mingling and networking, laying the groundwork for careers that would shape the legal landscape for decades to come. "You know," James said, "when I first became a justice, I worried that I was abandoning the front lines, that by moving up to the Supreme Court, I was leaving behind the individual cases and clients that had defined my career. And now? Now I understand that there are many ways to fight. Some people are at their best in the trenches, arguing cases and representing clients. Others do their best work shaping policy, influencing institutions, building systems that make justice more accessible to everyone." He looked at his son with pride. "You've found a way to do both, to stay connected to individual cases while also building something larger, something that will outlast any single verdict or ruling. That's rare, Marcus. That's special." "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have. That's what I've been trying to tell you all along. You have everything you need inside you, the talent, the drive, the integrity. All I did was point you in the right direction." Marcus shook his head. "It was more than that, Dad. You showed me what was possible. You showed me that the fight is worth fighting, even when the odds seem impossible. You showed me that one person can make a difference." James smiled. "And now you're showing the same thing to others, to Maria, to the people in that audience, to everyone who comes to your center looking for help. That's how change happens, Marcus. One person at a time, one case at a time, one generation at a time." "The chain," Marcus murmured. "Exactly, the chain. We're all just links in something much larger than ourselves, something that started long before we were born and will continue long after we're gone. The only thing we can control is whether we keep the chain strong, whether we pass along what we've learned to those who come after us." Marcus thought about that as he looked around the room. All these lawyers, all these potential links in the chain. Some would go on to pursue wealth and prestige, forgetting their obligations to those less fortunate. But others, he hoped, would remember why they had entered the profession in the first place, would find their own ways to fight for justice, to lift others up, to make the world a little bit better than they found it. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and disappointments, cases lost and battles abandoned. The forces arrayed against them were powerful and entrenched, with resources and connections that the advocates of change could only dream of. But they had something more valuable than money or power. They had purpose, they had community, they had each other. And they had the unshakable belief that the fight was worth fighting, that justice, however imperfectly realized, was better than injustice accepted, that the arc of the moral universe, as another fighter for justice had once said, bends toward righteousness, but only if enough people are willing to put their hands on it and push. Marcus was ready to push. He had been pushing his whole life, and he would keep pushing until he had no strength left, until the chain passed to the next generation, until the work he had started was carried forward by those who came after. That was his legacy, not the cases he had won, or the speeches he had given, or the recognition he had received, but the people he had inspired, the institutions he had built, the countless small acts of courage that would ripple out from his life into the future. As the reception wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus found himself alone at a window, looking out at the city lights below. The same city where his father had fought his first battles, where Marcus had argued his first case, where the Thompson Justice Center now stood as a beacon of hope for those who had been told they didn't matter. His phone buzzed with a text from Denise. "Great speech. We're all proud of you. See you back at the center." Marcus smiled and typed a reply. "On my way, the work continues." He pocketed his phone and headed for the exit, already thinking about the cases waiting for him, the clients who needed his help, the battles yet to be fought. The fight was never over, but that was okay. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. 2 years later, Marcus stood in the chamber of the Supreme Court of the United States, waiting for the proceedings to begin. It was the most prestigious venue in the American legal system, a room where the fate of laws and liberties had been decided for over 2 centuries. He was there to argue a case, Thompson Justice Center vs. State of Tennessee, challenging a law that made it virtually impossible for low-income residents to access legal aid services. The case had worked its way up through the lower courts, generating controversy and attention at every level, until finally the Supreme Court had agreed to hear it. The irony was not lost on Marcus. He was about to argue before a court on which his own father sat. James had recused himself from the case, of course, but his influence could be felt in the very existence of the Access to Justice initiative that had brought the Thompson Justice Center into being. The other justices took their seats, and the Chief Justice called the proceedings to order. Marcus rose, his heart pounding but his voice steady, and began his argument. "May it please the court, the question before you today is simple. Does the Constitution permit a state to erect barriers that effectively deny legal representation to its most vulnerable citizens? We contend that it does not. The right to access the courts, to petition for redress of grievances, is fundamental to our system of government. A state that makes this right available only to those who can afford it is not upholding the Constitution, but undermining it." The argument lasted an hour, with justices peppering Marcus with questions, probing his logic, testing his reasoning. He answered each one directly and confidently, drawing on years of experience and preparation. When it was over, when both sides had made their case, and the justices had retreated to deliberate, Marcus walked out of the Supreme Court building and into the bright sunshine of a Washington afternoon. His father was waiting for him on the steps. "How do you think it went?" James asked. "Hard to say. The questions were tough but fair. I made the best argument I could." "That's all anyone can do." They walked together toward the mall, past the monuments and memorials that lined the great expanse of grass. "Whatever the outcome," Marcus said, "I'm glad I had the chance to argue before the court, to stand in that room and make the case for justice. Not many people get that opportunity. You earned it every step of the way." "I had help." James smiled. "We all have help. That's how the chain works. No one succeeds alone." They found a bench and sat down, looking out at the Washington Monument rising against the blue sky. "When I was your age," James said, "I thought I had to save the world myself, that if I just worked hard enough, fought long enough, I could fix everything that was broken. It took me decades to realize that change doesn't work that way. It's not about individual heroes. It's about collective effort, about building institutions and movements that can carry the work forward even after any single person is gone." "The Thompson Justice Center." "Exactly. Whether we win this case or not, the center will continue. The attorneys you've trained, the clients you've helped, the precedents you've established, all of that endures. That's the real victory, Marcus. Not any single case, but the infrastructure of justice that you've helped create." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand that now. I didn't always. When I started out, I was so focused on winning, on proving that I belonged, that I could go toe-to-toe with the big firms and come out on top. And now? Now I see that winning isn't the point. The point is showing up, making the argument, giving people hope that their voices matter, even if the outcome isn't what we wanted." "That's wisdom," James said. "Hard-won wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the tourists and joggers pass by, the eternal bustle of the nation's capital carrying on around them. "Dad," Marcus said finally, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with the case, whatever happens with my career, I'm grateful. Grateful for everything you've taught me, everything you've given me, the example you've set." James reached over and squeezed his son's hand. "I'm grateful too, Marcus. Grateful that I got to watch you grow into the man you've become. Grateful that the values I tried to teach you took root and flourished. Grateful that the chain continues." "The chain continues," Marcus echoed. They rose from the bench and walked back toward the court, two generations of fighters united by their commitment to justice, their belief in the power of the law to change lives, their determination to keep pushing against the weight of an imperfect world. The ruling in Thompson Justice Center versus State of Tennessee came down 3 months later. By a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court struck down the Tennessee law, holding that states could not impose barriers that effectively denied legal representation to those who could not afford it. Marcus was in his office when he heard the news. He sat stunned for a moment, unable to process what had happened. Then the phone started ringing, and the emails started flooding in, and the reporters started showing up at the center's doors, and he realized that everything had changed. The victory was covered by every major news outlet. Commentators called it a landmark decision, a turning point in the fight for equal justice. Legal scholars analyzed its implications, predicting that it would open the door to a wave of new challenges to laws that discriminated against the poor. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moment came that evening, when the crowds had dispersed and the cameras had gone away, and he was finally alone in his office. His phone rang. It was his father. "Congratulations," James said. "You did it." "We did it," Marcus corrected, "all of us together." "That's true, but you were the one standing in that chamber making the argument. You were the one who convinced 6 justices that the Constitution means what it says." Marcus felt tears welling in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad, without everything you taught me, without the example you set. And I couldn't have done any of what I've done without my parents and my mentors and the countless people who fought for justice before I was even born. That's the chain, Marcus. We're all just links." "I know, I finally understand." "Then you understand the most important thing, that it's not about any single person or any single case. It's about the movement, the ongoing struggle for a more just world. We play our part, and then we pass the torch to the next generation." Marcus looked around his office, at the photographs on the walls, the files on his desk, the remnants of a career dedicated to the proposition that everyone deserves equal treatment under the law. "I'm ready," he said. "Ready to keep fighting, ready to pass on what I've learned." "I know you are. That's why I'm proud of you, son. Not because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you've become." They talked for a while longer about the case and its implications, about the work that remained to be done, about the hopes and fears that came with any significant change. And when they finally said goodbye, Marcus felt a peace settling over him that he hadn't experienced in years. He had spent his whole life trying to prove himself, trying to show that he belonged, that he was worthy, that the doubters and naysayers were wrong. And now, finally, he understood that the proof wasn't in the verdicts or the accolades or the recognition. It was in the daily commitment to doing the work, in the willingness to show up day after day and fight for what was right. That was the legacy his father had passed to him, and it was the legacy he would pass to those who came after. The chain continued, the fight went on, and somewhere in courtrooms and law offices and community centers across the country, a new generation of advocates was rising, ready to take their place in the long march toward justice. Marcus smiled, turned off his desk lamp, and headed home. Tomorrow there would be new cases to file, new arguments to make, new battles to fight. He couldn't wait. The years that followed brought more cases, more victories, more setbacks, more learning. The Thompson Justice Center grew, opening offices in 3 more states and training hundreds of attorneys in the art of civil rights litigation. The Supreme Court decision opened doors that had been closed for decades, and Marcus and his team walked through them with determination and hope. James Thompson retired from the Supreme Court at the age of 81, his legacy secure as one of the most influential justices of his generation. He spent his remaining years traveling the country, speaking at law schools and conferences, inspiring a new generation of advocates to take up the cause of justice. When he passed away at the age of 86, surrounded by family and loved ones, the legal community mourned the loss of a giant. Tributes poured in from around the world, from former colleagues and opposing counsel, from clients whose lives he had changed, and students whose careers he had shaped. But the most moving tribute came from Marcus, who stood at his father's memorial service and spoke about what James had meant to him. "My father taught me that the law is not just a profession," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a calling, a commitment to something larger than ourselves. He showed me that one person can make a difference, not by being a hero, but by doing the hard work of building institutions and movements that outlast any individual life." He paused, gathering himself. "When I was young, I wanted to be like my father, to achieve what he had achieved, to earn the recognition he had earned. But as I grew older, I realized that the point wasn't to be like him. The point was to be myself, fully and authentically, while carrying forward the values he had taught me: justice, integrity, perseverance. The belief that every person deserves to be heard, to be represented, to have their day in court." Marcus looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had known and loved his father, who had been touched by his work and inspired by his example. "The chain continues," he said. "That was my father's favorite phrase. He understood that the fight for justice doesn't end with any single person or any single generation. It's an ongoing struggle, passed from hand to hand, link to link, across the years and decades and centuries." He straightened his shoulders, his voice growing stronger. "My father is gone, but his work lives on. In the cases he argued, the opinions he wrote, the lives he touched, and in all of us who carry his legacy forward, who wake up each morning determined to make the world a little bit better than we found it." Marcus stepped back from the podium, his tribute complete. The crowd rose to its feet, applauding not just for the words he had spoken, but for the man they honored and the cause they all shared. Later that evening, alone in his father's study, Marcus found a letter addressed to him. It was in James's handwriting, dated just a few weeks before his death. "My dear Marcus," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my time has come. Please don't grieve too long. I've lived a full life, filled with purpose and meaning and love. What more could anyone ask? I want you to know how proud I am of you, not for the cases you've won or the recognition you've received, but for the man you've become. You've found your own path, your own voice, your own way of fighting for what's right. That's all I ever wanted for you. Remember that the fight doesn't end. There will always be new challenges, new obstacles, new reasons to despair. But there will also always be new allies, new opportunities, new reasons to hope. The chain continues, Marcus. You're an important link in it now. Guard that responsibility carefully. I love you, son. I always have, and I always will, even from whatever comes next. Your father, James." Marcus held the letter for a long time, tears streaming down his face. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. The chain continued, and he would guard it with everything he had. Years later, an elderly Marcus Thompson stood in the lobby of the Davidson County Courthouse, watching as a young attorney argued her first case. Maria Gonzalez had come a long way since that conference years ago, when she had approached him with trembling hands and a law school acceptance letter. Now she was a rising star in the legal aid community, passionate and brilliant and determined. Marcus had mentored her through law school, through her early career, through the inevitable setbacks and disappointments that came with this work. And now he was watching her carry the torch forward. The case was about housing discrimination. A landlord who had systematically denied apartments to families with children. Maria's argument was crisp and compelling, her evidence overwhelming. The judge, a young woman who had herself benefited from legal aid growing up, listened attentively and asked probing questions. When the verdict came back in Maria's favor, Marcus felt a surge of pride that almost brought him to his knees. This was what it was all about. Not his own achievements, but the achievements of those he had helped along the way. The chain extending into the future, link by link, generation by generation. Maria emerged from the courtroom, her face flushed with triumph. She spotted Marcus and rushed over to embrace him. "We did it," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "We actually did it." "You did it," Marcus corrected. "I was just watching." "No, you taught me everything I know. You believed in me when no one else did. This victory is yours as much as mine." Marcus shook his head gently. "It's not about either of us, Maria. It's about the family that can now find a home. It's about the message we send to landlords everywhere that discrimination won't be tolerated. It's about the chain." Maria pulled back, looking at him with understanding in her eyes. "The chain, you've told me about that. It's the most important lesson I learned from my father, that we're all just links in something much larger than ourselves. Our job is to do our part, and then pass along what we've learned to those who come after us. And that's what you've done for me. And that's what you'll do for someone else, and they'll do for someone after them, on and on, until one day, maybe, the world is finally as just as it should be." Maria smiled. "That's a beautiful vision. It's the only one worth fighting for." They walked out of the courthouse together, into the bright sunshine of a new day. The city bustled around them, millions of lives being lived, millions of stories being written, millions of struggles being fought. And somewhere out there, Marcus knew, a new generation of advocates was rising, young people who would learn from those who came before, who would take up the cause of justice and carry it forward into a future that none of them could yet imagine. The chain continued. The fight went on, and as long as there were people willing to show up, to do the work, to believe that change was possible, there was hope. There was always hope. Marcus looked up at the sky, thought of his father, and smiled. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered, "for everything." And then he headed back to work. There were cases to file, arguments to make, battles to fight. The chain awaited,